The Vineyard has many markers, maybe more than its share of markers, erected to commemorate one historical event or another. But only 2 of them are statues. One memorializes the Heath hen and is perched at the edge of the state forest, which was created too little too late to stave the heath hen's habitat and thus keep the species from going extinct, which it did in 1932, long before the statue was put up. The other, much more visible, looming over the steamship landing at Oak Bluffs, depicts a Civil War soldier. Maybe you'd noticed. This is a story about that statue, but it's also necessarily and inseparably a story about a man, about a town, about a war, and about people's memories of that war, and about the way we as a society choose to remember wars and the soldiers who fought them. It's a complicated story about an apparently simple object, but it's interesting and important today more than ever, precisely because it's complicated. No matter what you think coming in about the Oak Bluffs Civil War Monument, I want to try to put you in a position where you walk out today thinking, wow, it's more complicated than I thought. But first things first, it is not a Confederate soldier. Despite what Gale Huntington, who should have known better, wrote in his introduction to Martha's Vineyard in 1969, despite what your tour bus operator may have told you, despite what your cousin Bob, who knows the truth, man, and it's not what you think, may have explained at tedious length over lobsters last weekend, it's a Union soldier, folks. The statue is bronze, the base is cast iron, the pedestal is New Hampshire granite, but damn it, the uniform is Federal. As you'd notice if you look at the belt buckle, the cartridge box, or the cap badge, all of which say U.S., something that the people who painted the darn thing gray back in 1980 seem to have neglected to do. The man depicted in the statue is a member of the Union Army, which from the get-go makes the Oak Bluffs Civil War Monument different in at least that one fundamental respect from the monuments that have been the center of controversy in Charlottesville, in Baltimore, in Richmond, and in any number of other places, mostly south of the Mason-Dixon line. It was not, in the sense that most of those were, set up by a white-dominated or exclusively white government to assert power over the African-American population and to express sympathy with the great lost cause of the Confederacy and thus buy into that mendacious rewriting of history in which the South was a grand, glorious, well, see the prologue for Gone with the Wind, society that was driven to destruction by the evil Mordor-like forces of the North. It's not that. It's something, as I said at the outset, considerably more complicated than that. The man depicted in the statue is a member of the Union Army, but the man behind the statue was a veteran of the Confederate Army. Enter Charles Strahan, born in Baltimore, 1840, to English immigrant parents. Maryland was a slave state. The famous Mason-Dixon line divided Maryland in the south from Pennsylvania in the north and slavery from freedom, more or less. But unlike its southern neighbor, Virginia, Maryland did not secede. Trahan and other Southern supporters, however, needed only to cross the border into Virginia to join the Confederate ranks. And in 1862, Trahan, age 22, did just that, joining a unit called the Maryland Guards, which was promptly absorbed, sans its perhaps overly grand name, into the 21st Virginia Regiment as Company B. They were duly sent into a battle that the South called Seven Pines and the North called Fair Oaks, both of which seem somehow far too gentle for people lining up with muskets trying to murder each other. Private Trahan was wounded, and after his convalescence, he returned to the war with a lieutenant's commission and an assignment as aide-de-camp to General Isaac Trimble. a civil engineer who'd made his name before the war designing railway systems, and who achieved a kind of improbable fame by getting into a quarrel with his Corps commander, General Ewell, on the second day of Gettysburg, essentially throwing down his sword and stomping out of the tent, which promptly got memorialized by Michael Shara in his novel The Killer Angels. There is a certain, I suppose, justice to, if you're going to be hot-headed and argue with your commanding officer, to have that be the only thing your entire military career is remembered for forever after. In any event, Strahan made it through Gettysburg intact, which is more than can be said for Trimble, who was wounded in the leg and was obliged to have it amputated. He finished out the war, Strahan finished out the war in relatively quiet order, married, moved to New Orleans, became a coffee merchant. But then in 1884, something happened. Apparently his health, or perhaps something that isn't recorded in the historical documents. But in 1884, he left New Orleans, sold the coffee business, and moved north to Cottage City, then all of 4 years old, having become independent of Edgartown in 1880. Why the North, after a lifetime spent in and fighting for the South? Why the Vineyard? Why Cottage City? We don't know. All we know is that he came and bought the Cottage City Star, which had been founded a few years earlier as Cottage City's own weekly newspaper, a 4-page broadsheet that published throughout the year, unlike earlier Cottage City papers. His ambition was to turn it into an island-wide paper, a competitor to the Vineyard Gazette, which he did, renaming it the Martha's Vineyard Herald, under which name it lasted into the early 1920s, when the Gazette bought it. In time, the Herald became not only the island's second island-wide newspaper, but also the vehicle for Strahan's campaign to erect a statue in Cottage City to memorializing the veterans of the Civil War. The campaign began with a highly public snub, and this is one of those places where the story starts to get improbably complicated in an unexpected way. The year was 1887. Strahan had lived in Cottage City for 3 years, and the Herald, under his editorship, ran a seemingly innocuous announcement that there would be a Memorial Day celebration at the end of the coming month of May. There was nothing in and of itself remarkable about this. Memorial Day had been celebrated, usually under the name Decoration Day, since 1868, people decorating the graves of Civil War soldiers in order to remember the war's dead. But the reaction to the Herald's, that is, Strahan's advertisement, was immediate. Former Union soldiers in Cottage City, some former Union soldiers in Cottage City, made it known that if a, quote, former rebel, one suspects that in the privacy of their own home the word damned may have worked its way into that phrase, was going to be involved, they wanted no part of the event. If he was coming, they would stay away. Strahan, not wanting to alienate his still relatively new neighbors, stayed away. But he sent a reporter who covered the event in a long and fulsome story headlined The Boys in Blue that could not have conceivably given offense to anybody who'd served in the Union Army. It ran alongside a letter from a Union veteran named Sidney Hicks, who referred to Strahan as a certain long-ago Confederate Army officer, now a worthy, law-abiding resident of our island city, and took his fellow veterans to task for what he, Hicks, regarded as a meanness of spirit. He cited the story, possibly apocryphal, of a Union corporal who had lost both feet in the war and yet had found it within him to forgive the people who'd been on the other side. If the corporal could do it, Hicks asked, why could not his fellow Union veterans in Oak Bluffs. 4 years pass. It's now in 1891. Cottage City is at the peak of its Victorian splendor. It's a wonderland of elaborate cottages, towering resort hotels, of which the biggest of all, the Seaview, towers at 4 stories, 5 in the tower, over the steamer wharf. An immense roller rink stands across the street. Bathhouses line Ocean Avenue with people in wool bathing suits descending into the waters to stand around up to their waist and wonder when somebody's going to get around to inventing the idea of swimming as an athletic activity. The flying horses are settled into their new home at the foot of Circuit Avenue. Wheelmen, as they're called, whistle across the newly paved streets on their new safety bicycles, the kind where the 2 wheels are the same size. Imagine that. It is 3 months out of the year anyway, a thriving, booming resort town. Not Newport or Saratoga Springs, perhaps, but a town on the rise. But it is also, unless you're a Methodist who's been coming to the camp meetings since before the Civil War was even a dark cloud on the horizon, it's also largely a town without a past. The separation from Edgartown is still only about a decade old. When the Civil War broke out, when the boys from the Vineyard went off to the war, Oak Bluffs, Cottage City did not exist. It lacks still a certain sense of gravitas, a certain sense of having been present on Earth, of having been a real place, not just an ephemeral summer wonderland. And that may, perhaps, have been part of what motivated Strahan in his desire for a statue. That part we don't know. What we do know from reading between the lines of the 3 pronouncements he made about the statue in 1891 was that he desperately, with every fiber of his being, right to the bottom of his soul, wanted the people of Oak Bluffs, specifically the Union veterans who'd snubbed him 3 years earlier, to like him, to accept him, to treat him as a fellow citizen of Cottage City. There is in his writings of 1891 an almost pathetic desperation, a overwhelming desire to be liked and accepted. His vehicle for gaining that acceptance was to erect a statue honoring the Grand Army of the Republic, about which more in a moment. He announced early in 1891, donate the proceeds of every Herald subscription sold that season to the fund that he was raising to put up a statue. Subscription to the Herald went for $2 in those days. The monument was expected to cost $2,000. In the end, by midsummer, the campaign was $500 short, not wanting to stretch the process out, not wanting to lose the momentum. Strahan made up the difference out of his own pocket. This in a day when $500 was significant money. So let's pause here just for a moment, lest another one of the strange, complicating elements in this story slip by unnoticed. Most war memorials are erected by organizations, veterans groups, municipal governments, military units, in honor of individuals, specific individuals like Robert E. Lee, or on the plaza downtown in Providence where the buses used to pull in, General Ambrose Burnside, a man known for 2 things, his facial hair, sideburns, really, that's where the name came from, and his utter, complete, staggering ineptitude on the battlefield. Ambrose Burnside was the man who allegedly caused Abraham Lincoln to quip after one particularly disastrous battle. Only Burnside could have achieved such a coup, snatching one last defeat from the jaws of victory. And yet, the people of Providence saw fit to honor Ambrose Burnside, presumably because he was a local boy. I've never bothered to check. Which I mention here not to get a cheap laugh out of Ambrose Burnside, although that's always good fun, but to point out that people erect statues for many reasons. Governments erect them to honor local heroes. Governments erect them, as in the South during the Jim Crow era, again during the Civil Rights era, as an expression of power over the people they wish to oppress. People erect statues in an effort to exalt themselves. Think Imperial Rome. People, in Strahan's case, erect statues in a desperate effort to make their fellow townspeople love them, which may be a first in the history of public monuments. Strahan, the individual, arranged for a monument to be erected not in honor of Union veterans, not in honor of the Union dead, but in honor of a Union veterans organization, the Grand Army of the Republic. The Grand Army of the Republic was not the title of any body of the U.S. of the Federal Armed Forces during the war. It was, or at least in the sense that Strahan was referring to it, it was a veterans organization formed after the war, open only to Union veterans, which became, in the decades following the war, the premier veterans lobbying organization in America. 1890, the GAR had 400,000 members nationwide. Voting as a bloc, they were part of what swung 5 presidential elections between Grant and McKinley to the Republican Party. They successfully pushed through veterans benefit legislation, such as a bill that allowed veterans of the Civil War to claim government subsidies for injuries or infirmities from any source, regardless of whether it was war wounds or simply the depredations of old age. Since this was pushed through at a time when the average Union veteran was well into middle age, it meant that, for all practical purposes, they'd managed, at least for veterans, to achieve free government-subsidized health care, something no other lobbying organization has ever achieved in American history. The GAR was a formidable organization, and it was an organization in which the kind of people who had snubbed Strahan in his first attempt to advertise a Memorial Day observation in his paper, the kind of people for whom their identities as not just veterans but Union veterans was absolutely central to their self-image, the kind of organization that those people, the people he was trying to reach, the people he was trying to bring over to his way of seeing things, to accept him, would have belonged to. It's this focus on reaching out to the GAR that accounts for the text on the first 3 plaques around the base of the statue, the 3 that were put in place when the statue was erected in 1891. The first, as it originally read, said simply, erected in honor of the Grand Army of the Republic. The second said, Henry Clay Wade Post GAR number 201, a reference to the relatively recently founded Oak Bluffs GAR post, of which we have the records in our archives. The third read simply FC&L, which was a reference not to the foundry that cast the statue, as one historian suggested inaccurately, but to the 3 official guiding principles of the GAR: fraternity, charity, and loyalty. By dedicating the statue to the GAR, by writing the wording on the 3 plaques that way, Strahan was speaking directly to the GAR in general, but specifically to the GAR in Oak Bluffs, and through them to Oak Bluffs Union veterans. And you know what? It worked. Offering to put up a $2,000 statue in honor of the people who'd snubbed you is a great way to get their attention. And Strahan's gesture did that. He was immediately invited by the head of the Cottage City chapter of the GAR, not just to attend the 1891 Memorial Day celebration, Memorial Day observances, celebration is profoundly the wrong word, not just to attend them, but to give the featured address. Once he got through the standard boilerplate opening where he thanked the head of the GAR post for the invitation, thanked the ladies of the auxiliary for preparing such a fine repast and all that sort of thing, he launched into a story from his personal experience. The mists of prejudice, he said, which have hung like a cloud over me and this my adopted home, are fast disappearing under the warm sunlight of your affectionate and brotherly hearts. This is what I meant when I said this man oozes neediness, oozes need to be accepted by these people who gave him the back of their hand. And he expressed the hope that that acceptance, that feeling of affection, that brotherly comradeship would become universal among veterans. It would be, to me, a higher honor than to be president, he proclaimed, if I could be the man to throw the last shovelful of earth over the bloody chasm, meaning the chasm that divides Union and Confederate veterans north and south and so forth. And this is where, depending on what viewpoint you take, depending on where you're standing as you look at the events, the story once again starts to become more complicated. That was Memorial Day, 1891. 3 months later, the statue is dedicated in August of 1891. The Oak Bluffs the Cottage City selectmen, having rubber stamped approval of it in what must have been, judging by the text of the approval, a matter of mere minutes. Think about that. 1891, a space was made for the statue at the junction of Lake and Circuit and Oak Bluffs Avenues, essentially, give or take, where the information booth stands now. For those of you keeping track at home, it would stand there until 1930, when it was relocated to its present site opposite the Steamship Authority to avoid being a traffic hazard in the age of increasingly numerous cars. 1891, we have the pictures in our archives. The pictures are reprinted in the article about the statue in the Intelligencer, which you're all more than welcome to a free copy of, as well as a free copy of the one about restoring the statue. You look at the pictures of the dedication, and Lake Avenue is packed, sidewalk to sidewalk, all the way up the hill. There are bands, there are GAR members in their quasi-military uniforms, there are women in parasols, there are carriages around the edges, and there in the middle of it all was Trahan standing around the statue, draped, the statue is draped, not Strahan, in an American flag. His 5-year-old daughter, clad in a white dress, reaches up, pulls a cord, and the flag slides off the statue, revealing him in all his waxed bronze glory. And Strahan delivers himself of another address that expands on the themes that he discussed at Memorial Day earlier in the year. We are once more a union of Americans, a union which endears with equal honor the citizen of Georgia with the citizen of Maine, that Massachusetts and South Carolina are again brothers, and that there is no North or South, no East or West, but one undivided, indivisible union. On like this for several more paragraphs, arguing that the division between North and South was closed, and that henceforth America would stand firm and united against any enemies, foreign and domestic. Few weeks after that, this time in the pages of the Herald, he expressed himself on the subject of the statue one more time. In an editorial, he noted that the tablet on the fourth side of the statue was blank, and he expressed the hope that someday, when the passions of war are lost in forgetfulness, the dwindling ranks of Union veterans might inscribe on that blank plaque a token of respect to their old foes in the field. He wasn't alone in expressing this sentiment, either about the North and South are united again, we are once again one nation, nor in calling for gestures of ceremonial reconciliation between Northerners and Southerners, the blue and the gray, and so forth. Similar sentiments were being expressed in the North and the South by Union and Confederate veterans alike. And as the 19th century gave way to the 20th century, there was a wave of public demonstrations, public dramatizations of such reconciliations. Old men, some leaning on canes, some leaning on crutches to accommodate lost limbs from back in the 1860s, hobbling towards each other, shaking hands while photographers took pictures and the assembled crowd clapped. It reached a kind of pinnacle in 1913 at the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, when there was a gigantic public spectacle called, I should have looked it up and I didn't, but something along the lines of the Last Encampment, in which the veterans of the war, now in their 70s or even their 80s, returned to the battlefield and ceremonially shook hands with one another and declared the war over at last, declared that the terrible division between brothers had been resolved and that we were all one America again. The problem with this high-minded sentiment was that to anyone paying attention, it was blatantly, obviously, appallingly false. As false as Strahan's own statement in 1891 that no one now alive in the South could possibly differ from my belief that we are well rid of slavery. No one in the South could possibly want it back. Nonsense. America was no more one nation in 1891 or 1913 than it had been in 1861 or 1853, or at the moment when Senator Preston Brooks of South Carolina had beaten Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts unconscious and nearly to the point of death with his walking stick during a debate over slavery on the floor of the Senate. Race and the subjugation of one race by another divided the country before the Civil War. The South had, as its leaders had, thankfully for historians, repeatedly, explicitly, and unqualifiedly stated at the time, had seceded and gone to war in defense of their rights to maintain a society built on chattel slavery and their citizens' rights to practice murder, rape, kidnapping, and terrorism unmolested by their own governments, free from the touch of the law, against what they regarded as an inferior race. The war had crushed the rebellion. The 13th Amendment, pushed through Congress by Lincoln before the southern states were allowed to have have representatives in Congress, had put paid, at least in a legal sense, to chattel slavery, but sharecropping and debt peonage had immediately taken its place, and the tools of racial subjugation that had existed before the war remained in vigorous and widespread use afterwards. The loathsome ideology that justified their use continued to flourish, not just unabated, but newly reinforced by white Southerners, many white Southerners' sense of aggrievedness over the loss of the war, their unique culture, their peculiar institution. The mindset that gave rise to the lost cause historiography that in the years around 1900 came to dominate the majority view of the war, even in the North. The decades bracketing 1900, during which Union and Confederate veterans were staging their, it must be said, wholly high-minded, largely well-intentioned ceremonies of reconciliation, genuinely trying to put the past behind them, took place against a backdrop in which America remained as divided over race as it had ever been, in which it was as dangerous to be African American in the South as it had ever been. The decades bracketing 1900, when Strahan was putting up the statue, and when the people of Oak Bluffs were first encountering it in the streets, were also the decades that brought America Jim Crow laws and sundown towns, the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, the Supreme Court's affirmation of the separate but equal doctrine in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. And against that backdrop, for some people then, for many people now, Strahan's or any white American's declaration that the chasm is closed, the war is over, we've kissed and made up, we're all one America, rang extraordinarily hollow. In 1925, Strahan was an old man, a dying man, an invalid, not even able to get out of bed to attend a ceremony at the monument. But in 1925, he did at last get his wish. The fourth plaque, blank for so long, blank since the monument was put up, was inscribed with a statement that began, "The chasm is closed," a deliberate callback to his own language in 1891. "The chasm is closed," it said, "in memory of the restored Union. This tablet is dedicated by Union veterans of the Civil War and patriotic citizens of Martha's Vineyard in honor of the Confederate soldiers." At the same time, the first plaque, which had originally read simply, "This monument is dedicated to the Grand Army of the Republic," was revised to read, "Erected in honor of the Grand Army of the Republic by Charles Strahan, Company B, 21st Virginia Infantry," explicitly acknowledging what had only been implicit in the original text, that Strahan was not merely a Southerner, but a Confederate veteran who had taken up arms against the Union. The moving figure behind those 1925 revisions to the statue was Sidney Eldridge, the wife of George W. Eldridge, the chart maker and tide table publisher of Vineyard Haven, the mother of Nina, Mary, Ruth, and Gracia Eldridge of the Elliot Eldridge Macy's book, The Captain's Daughters, and thus the grandmother of Sidney White, who gave me my first summer job in the museum business back at the Tisbury Museum on Beach Street. as far as I've ever been able to tell from reading about her and reading her writings, Sidney Eldridge was no more a racist, no more a white supremacist, no more an advocate of the lost cause or an unreconstructed Confederate than anybody else in Vineyard Haven or anybody else on the island. She was, like a lot of the people who staged and clapped at those gestures of reconciliation, a good-hearted person who was trying to make a statement about brotherhood, about forgiveness, about things like that. It's difficult to fault her for her intentions, but it seems entirely legitimate to suggest that her perspective may have been narrow, may have been bounded by her experience, may have been limited by the time and the place and the circumstances in which she was living, and that how her well-intentioned sentiments may have read to others, different places, different circumstances, different heritages, did not cross her mind. Love your enemies is a sentiment with a long and distinguished pedigree. But so, in the midst of a still unfinished struggle for the soul of a nation, is too soon. Charles Strahan died in March 1931, age 91, a year or so after the statue was moved to the edge of the Oak Bluffs waterfront. Harry Costello, the last Union Army veteran on the island, outlasted him by only a few years. My father once told me of a day when, at the age of 6 or 7, his mother took him to watch the Memorial Day parade through, I assume, Vineyard Haven. And he watched a man who must have been, given the timing, Harry Costello, ride by in an open car, impossibly old, still wearing his GAR uniform, head held high, and his mother saying to him, as he remembered it, "Look, Tony, there goes a veteran of the Civil War. You'll probably never see that again." And so it was. The last of the island veterans of the war were gone by the mid-30s, and the island was left, as we're left today, with the monument and with the questions. Can a representational statue raised in a public space carry a message other than one of officially sanctioned celebration of whatever it represents? Consider the 3 soldiers added by congressional fiat to Maya Lin's black granite Vietnam memorial. But also consider the Heath hen at the edge of the state forest, which surely is not a celebration of anything except the need to do better next time. Can honor paid to Confederate soldiers be separated from honor paid to the cause they serve? Many have in the aftermath of Charlottesville argue no, certainly not. And there's much to support that. We don't, even though in other circumstances we might, honor the audacity of Admiral Yamamoto's plan to attack Pearl Harbor or General Burgoyne's plan to take Saratoga. On the other hand, we do, every Memorial Day, every Veterans Day, mourn the casualties and celebrate the veterans of all America's wars equally, not making distinctions between the just and the unjust wars, of which any student of American history must admit there have been both. Well, you could argue that there haven't been both, but I'd like to talk to you about the Mexican-American War sometime. Can the moment when it's no longer too soon and reconciliation becomes imaginable at last be established simply by declaring it so? Ask the question in West Belfast sometime, but also ask it in Miami's Little Havana. Put it to Nelson Mandela, sure, but also to Elie Wiesel, or maybe Simon Wiesenthal. These are not the kind of questions that have once and for all answers. If I was back in the classroom, I'd make some comment here about if you want certainty, the math department is across the quad. But like all the questions that matter most, these are questions that have answers that change as we change, and that we are thus destined to revisit again and again, seeing them anew each time, noticing things we hadn't noticed before. The past is not dead, said William Faulkner, who, as a man who grew up in the early part of this century in Mississippi, certainly had reason to know. The past is not dead, it's not even past. And that, I'd submit, is the best of all reasons to keep talking about it. Thank you very much.